Hey guys, it's Kevin with my review for the latest new limited series from Netflix, of course being Halston. What Halston is essentially about is basically we center on, well, the life of Halston. He was this fashion designer of sorts that really has sort of faded out into the ether. He's not really that well known these days, and we basically track him as he first starts off, and he's this very ambitious, he's this very ambitious guy who he really wants to make this like worldwide fashion empire, and we see how he eventually does develop that, but then how that ultimately does kill him, and we start to see the rise and eventual fall of, how this all ends up working out for him and things like that. So Halston overall, I was really excited for this show. Anytime there is a Ryan Murphy limited series, I always do have skepticism. I do, because of the fact that there are some, especially recently, that have not really delivered in the way that I overall wanted them to, but with the talent that was attached to this one, and the fact that this was centered on a figure that I really did not know all that much about, I was really expecting this to be something really special. I could see that Murphy wasn't nearly as involved with this one as he's been with some other shows, so I really did think this show was going to turn out to be something really good. But I also, like I said, had a lot of skepticism, because around this time last year, I was really excited to watch a Ryan Murphy show, Hollywood, and that was a show that I thought could have been something really special. It was, centering on the golden age of Hollywood, kind of giving notoriety to, some actors and actresses that didn't really get it around that time, and I thought it could have been something really special, and instead it was a very cliche and underwritten series, and I was really hoping that Halston could be something a lot better than that. Halston could be something really special. But the other thing that really did concern me is that, we got to like Thursday of when the show was supposed to come out, and there were still no reviews at all. There was not a single review out for this show. Nobody was talking about it, and so that led me to the conclusion that this show is garbage, that there's a reason why they are waiting so long to drop those reviews at the last second, because this show is going to turn out to not be very good. So Friday came, and the reviews were pretty much a resounding meh, pretty much. Like, nobody really felt much towards this show, and after watching it, yeah, I'm kind of on that same level. I'm not gonna lie. Sorry to say that, this is yet another very deeply unsatisfying project from Ryan Murphy, but I will give it this. It's a far more ambitious show than I really was overall expecting. It's definitely different from other things that he's done, but as a whole, it did not really come together in the way that I really wanted it to. But we are just getting into right now, starting off with the cast. And easily, that's the best thing about this entire show. If it wasn't for the cast here, I really think the show would just be kind of awful. But I think the cast really does make it into something a little bit better than what it is. Of course, let's first address the elephant out of the room. Ewan McGregor as Halston. Look, he's one of the best talents working today. I feel like you put him in anything, you're at least going to get a really good performance out of him. And, unsurprisingly, he absolutely crushes it here. I loved what he did playing this character. He really does go all in showing the charisma, but also the flamboyance of this character. You can see the passion that Halston really does have for fashion, and how he's willing to put that over basically everything else within his life, and I think he did do a really great job with that, but especially in the last few episodes of the show, really conveyed just how much this meant to Halston and how much he ended up losing, and he added a lot more richness and layers to this character that he otherwise would not have had if McGregor was not playing him. He absolutely just dominated this role here, and I think the show is worth watching alone just to see his performance, because I think he really did something special here, and definitely for me was the best part of this entire series. When things were not working, McGregor was always working for me, and I love what he ended up doing here. But the other real standout for me in the show was Krysta Rodriguez, who plays Liza Minnelli, and Krysta Rodriguez is someone that I've seen in several projects, going all the way back to the Smash days. Remember that show? Back in like 2013, I used to love it, and now I've realized it's kind of garbage. But she was in that, and I've been a big fan of her since then. I've followed her in, certain Broadway shows like First Date and The Addams Family and things like that. I've always thought that she was a very special talent, and she is fantastic in this role. I feel like not enough people are really talking about just how good she is at Liza Minnelli. No, this might not be the most accurate portrayal. This is not on the level of, say, the performance we got from, I can't remember her name now, but in Fosse Verdon, the actress that played her was like spot on as Liza Minnelli. This is much more of an interpretation of Liza Minnelli, but it really does work as one. I think the mannerisms she gets down really well. I think she understands the kind of person that Liza Minnelli really is, and you can see she definitely did do her research, and I think overall she did a really good job playing this character. She never felt like a caricature to me. She felt like a real person because she is in fact a real person, and the relation between McGregor and Rodriguez was really well done here. I thought these two worked really well together. Whenever they're on screen, I feel like that's when the show is really at its best. I think that the two of them just had such a natural chemistry, and it was just one of the best parts of the entire show for me. So I think she definitely did a really great job here. And like I said, I really do wish more people were talking about her, but I think the show really does demonstrate just how talented an individual Rodriguez really is, and I hope she's able to pick up more roles after this show, because she really does have a lot more in her than I think people have overall given her credit for. When it comes to the rest of the performances in the show, they all do a pretty good job. David Pittu is pretty good as the character of Joe Ulu. He definitely does a good job. Same with Rebecca Dayan. I definitely did enjoy her performance in the show. Bill Pullman is Bill Pullman. You expect him to be good, and I didn't even know he was in the show, but he has a much more substantial role than I expected him to have, and he definitely does do a really good job playing this role overall. Some of the smaller roles as well, like Vera Farmiga shows up in like one scene, and it's one of the most memorable of the entire show because she is just so dynamic in this role. She's a great character actor in that way, and you really do see that when it comes to Farmiga. Similar to how Ewan McGregor is a great character actor, and then same with Farmiga here for sure. Rory Culkin is great in this show. Sullivan Jones, really just, I think everyone really did a great job in terms of the acting here. There are quite a few issues I have with the show, but the acting really isn't one of them. So now let's dive into things that I do think ultimately do bring the show down. The directing. Now, I will say, the one thing that's very impressive about the show is Daniel Minahan's directing. You go into a Ryan Murphy show, there's a lot of things you're expecting. You're expecting to be very flashy. You're expecting everything to be very heightened, kind of over the top, sometimes dipping into even soap opera territory, and this show is not really like that. It's a lot more subtle and a lot more subdued than it's surprisingly a lot more calmer and a lot more subdued than I think you overall would expect, and that's something I did really enjoy from Minahan. He was trying to go for something different here, and I've always said this with Ryan Murphy. When he takes a step back from projects, they turn out a lot better. You can tell when he's too involved with something, and with this one, I felt like because he wasn't as involved, he was able to do something a little bit different in terms of the tone for this show, and I think it overall really did work. I think Minahan does a good job in creating this more sort of subdued aesthetic to the show that was honestly kind of refreshing to watch, and I think his directing here was pretty solid. Definitely one that overall I think will keep you invested. There was never a point where I was like legitimately bored in the show. It's very watchable in that way, and I think he does a really good job at directing it overall. Now, that being said, I do think that while I enjoy his subdued aesthetic, I'm not entirely sure if it needed to be as calm as it really is, because when the show does start to dive into darker territory, it feels like it's not really going for it as much as it really should, and I feel like this show could have been a lot crazier. This show should have been a lot more flashier in that way because it would have aligned more with the character that we're centered on. So again, while I felt it was a refreshing mood, I'm not entirely sure if it was the right choice, and I'm not entirely sure if they did a good job with that. But what stuck out to me again is that Minahan was trying to go for something different here, and I did overall appreciate that. The writing is really where we get into the aspects of the show that just didn't really work for me overall. Starting off with the fact that I think a big thing to know going into the show is that if you're going into this thinking this is going to be like a definitive biopic of Halston, showing like, you know, him all the way from him being a child to him eventually, you know, dying and things like that, you're gonna be a bit more disappointed. The show is a lot more in common with the miniseries Fosse Verdon, a show that I really enjoyed a lot. I think that's a show that a lot of people have seemed to have forgotten, but that was a show that did a really good job at showing significant moments within Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon's life, but then also then showing, you know, chronicling their relationship and showing the highs and the lows of what they've really gone through and, you know, how involved they were in each other's lives and things like that. And so this show does have a lot in common with that, but the problem is, while Fosse Verdon, I think, did a really good job of filling in those gaps and getting you to understand the story and catching you up on things that have happened and giving you a full idea of, you know, what Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon were really doing and how, you know, how their relationship overall turned out. I feel like Halston kind of fails at doing that. I mean, a big thing about this show is that I think a lot of people don't really know a lot about Halston as a character. They don't really know who he was. They've probably heard the name Halston, you know, because it's attached to like certain fashions and things like that. If you're into that sort of thing, you've probably heard that name before. But you don't really know the man behind Halston. You don't really know a lot about him. And by the end of the show, I gotta be honest, I still did not feel I knew a lot about him. And I thought that was really disappointing because I do think there's a lot of things that the show does a good job with setting up. You get the sense that Halston is so passionate about becoming this fashion designer. It takes precedent over literally everything else in his life. He's willing to sacrifice his morals. He's willing to sacrifice who he really is. He's even willing to cut certain people out of his life as long as he can become this fashion designer, as long as he can have that success that he really wants to, that he really you can see soughts out. He really wants to become like the top fashion designer. He wants everything attached to his name and things like that. And the show does a good job with getting us to understand that. But what we fail to recognize is, why does he really feel this way? Why is Halston the way he is? We don't really get to see that. And the other thing is that there's, again, because the show is very similar to Fosse Verdon, there's a lot of time that passes by within this show. You know, we start off and it's like the early 1970s, and the show ends around the late 80s, and in that time, there's a lot that does happen, a lot of which we don't really get to see, and I think that does ultimately hurt the show than help it, because as a character, you know, we really don't know a ton about who Halston really is. We see a bunch of, you know, moments in his life, but it feels more like you're watching a collection of moments. That's what it really does feel like. It feels like, people have said it feels like a greatest hits collection for Halston, and I honestly think that's a pretty fair comparison, because, you know, every episode is a specific moment within his life. Every episode is something in a different time that he was involved with, and again, I like that idea. I like that it's structured in that way. It's something that is different than we've seen in other shows. Every episode almost can be like a standalone in that way, but the problem is it's just not a very satisfying watch overall. One of the biggest issues I had with the show is that there are a lot of characters that are introduced and then just kind of fade into the background, and they just go away without really any acknowledgement whatsoever. Perfect example of this is Joel Schumacher, Rory Culkin's character, who obviously, yes, he's a very famous director in that way, infamous director, I would say, but he's also someone that was very involved in Halston's life, and they give him this really interesting sort of side story where you think he's involved with substance abuse and things like that, and I was really kind of latching on to them, like, okay, I really want to see where this goes, and then episode 2 pops up, and he's just gone. They just got rid of him without any notice whatsoever, and they have like a brief mention of why he disappeared, but again, it's not a very satisfying one, because I wanted to see more of this story. I wanted to see more of what Schumacher was involved in. Why is he no longer with Halston? Why did he just disappear? Again, it's spoken to us, but it's lacking in impact because we don't really get to see a lot of what the show wants us to. And so I think that's a perfect example of something that the show just doesn't do a very good job with, is that, again, characters just kind of disappear without any notice. And I feel like they should have given a much bigger reason, or they should have tried to do what they can to fill in those gaps, and this show chooses to do neither of those things, and I just don't think it really works overall. Another example of this is Sullivan Jones's character. He starts off and you think that he's going to be like Halston's lover throughout the show. That's going to be his role. And then all of a sudden he's in the show, but he has a completely different role, and you don't understand why this happened. You don't understand, what changed things, when it came to his relationship with Halston, what really ended it. You don't have that understanding. You don't have that clarity. So I'm just not that attached to the story, and that's really what my issue is. It's not the fact that they decide to not show you any of it. It's the fact that we feel incredibly detached from Halston as a character. It's very hard to latch onto him. If we feel much more like an outsider looking in than anything. It's not really that in-depth look that we want. Another big issue I had is Halston's childhood. We get, aside from 1 to 2 brief glimpses of it, we have no understanding of why Halston turned out the way that he did. We just know that he clearly had a rough childhood. He had an abusive father clearly within his life, but again, this is just shown in glimpses. There's never a point where we get an in-depth moment where Halston is really kind of talking about how traumatic his childhood was and why he's gone in the direction that he has. So again, it just really disappointed me. It really disappointed me because I think the show could have been a lot better in that way. I think there was a way to really dive deeper into those aspects of his life, and we really didn't get to see that. There's a really great scene, for example, in episode 2, where you can see that there are all these fans and he's really overcome by it, but then he also seems a bit melancholy, like this isn't really what he wants, and I thought it was really interesting that we got to see that, but again, why does he feel this way? That's something that we just don't have much of an understanding of, and so I do think that really does hurt the show. In terms of all the other characters, like I said, they're really nothing. I mean, really, there's nothing to them. Elsa Peretti and Joe Ula especially, we really don't know much about either of these characters, except for the fact that they clearly are the most loyal to Halston in terms of his fashion industry. We don't really know much about them. They just kind of are mainstays in the show, and I found them to be kind of wasted. They try to give Pittu's character a little bit more to do in the back half of the show, but it's just a little too late for me, and I think they could have done a better job with that. And then Bill Pullman's character as well is utterly wasted here. I know that he was here, but I honestly can't remember a single thing that he did, and I literally just finished this show last week. I can't remember a single thing that Pullman did in this show. Nothing that he did in terms of his impact, nothing that he did in terms of the story. I can't remember anything about him, so that just tells you how little the show seems to care about a lot of its characters. The only relationship that's really well dived into is his relationship with Liza Minnelli. There's a really good introduction for why he is first enchanted by her, why these two eventually form the friendship that they do, and why she's really one of the only people that sticks by his side no matter what. That friendship felt very well fleshed out. It felt very natural. I felt like I was given a full story of what was really going on. Even though there were times where there were things we didn't get to see with Liza, I still felt like I had an understanding of what their bond was. I didn't feel that way with any of the other relationships in that show, and so I think that really did bring things down for me. Again, just that clarity just wasn't really there, and I think that really did hurt the show more than anything, especially in the back half of things when things really start to go to shit for Halston. At first, it's really good. episode 4, I think, is probably the best episode of this entire show because it gives you a really good understanding of what Halston is willing to sacrifice and what this ultimately has done to him as a result. But then you get to the finale, and there's a lot of moments that happen that are clearly supposed to be very impactful. They're clearly supposed to get a lot of emotion out of me, and again, it just wasn't really there. And that's the moment where I realized that I just didn't really like this show because of the fact that I didn't feel much towards these characters. I didn't feel much towards things going, in a sour direction for Halston because I didn't really get to see enough of him, going from rags to riches. I didn't get to see enough of the, transition from him being this, this ambitious designer to suddenly being this huge designer. We just don't really get to see that. The show is just kind of jumping through a lot of events, and like I said, I think that really does hurt the show overall, and it just overall left me with no impact whatsoever. So again, I just think the writing is not very good here. I think there are a lot of aspects in which they could have touched upon things and made it better, but it's just not really here. So that was easily the aspect of the show that just did not really work for me. The cinematography, though, I will say, the one thing you can always guarantee in any Ryan Murphy project is that it's gonna look really good, and the look and feel to this show is absolutely the right one. I mean, the way everything looks, you really get a sense of the time period that we're in, but then you also get a good sense of Halston's, designs on their own. I think they do a really good job with that, so I definitely enjoyed the cinematography in this show a lot. I think there's a lot of memorable shots in terms of the show overall, so that's something I was definitely very impressed by. And the score, I overall did like it. There's not really that much of a score to the show. It's much more of a soundtrack, and I think the soundtrack is really good because it helps you understand the time period that you're in, but not really a ton to say there. And the editing, this is another one of my huge issues with the show. Every episode of the show, so there's 5 episodes, right? And so when I heard that, I'm like, okay, these are probably all going to be really long. They're probably going to be over an hour at most. And it turned, and maybe even longer, if they wanted to. And instead, the majority of these episodes are only about 40 minutes long, and it's just not enough. It feels way too brief, and it feels way too rushed in that way, to the point where there were episodes that ended that I really had no reaction to them whatsoever. Episode 2, for example, I think is easily the weakest episode of this show because it really just kind of feels like filler. I watched that whole episode and I was just like, yeah, I have no idea how to feel about anything that just happened here because everything just was presented so quickly in that way. And so I don't think they did a very good job at diving into all of that. And this is the thing I have not understood about Ryan Murphy's Netflix project so far. He has the opportunity to have a platform that gives him as much time as he needs to devote to a story. He has as much time as he can to really flesh out a lot of what he wants to, and instead he chooses to half-ass it, and that I do blame him for because he is quite involved when it comes to the writing on this show, and I think the editing, especially with the way the show is done, he needed to do a much better job. Either he needed more episodes or he needed more time to these episodes because again, I just don't think that the show did a really good job with leaving an impact on me. And that's really my biggest thing with Halston is that I do think this is a watchable show. I think there's a lot of good performances here. There's a lot of memorable moments. The relation between Halston and Liza Minnelli is very well fleshed out. You do get a sense of Halston's passion. You do get a sense of how much he cared about the fashion industry. But you don't get a sense of why he really was this way. You don't really get a sense of who Halston really was, and by the end of the show, I just didn't really feel like I learned much of anything. And I feel like when you're watching a show like this, that's one of the most important things. You want to have a knowledge of someone that you really didn't. You wanted to have an understanding of who this person really was aside from a base level, and when the show wrapped up, I really felt like I knew just as little about Halston as I did going into it. And that's what ultimately made me realize I just didn't really like this show. Look, If you want a really nice, easy binge that I think is something that you can get through pretty quickly, you can have some memorable moments, but isn't really going to leave that much of an impact on you, by all means, go for it. But if you're looking for a definitive biopic of Halston, getting you to understand who he really was, getting you to understand why he is not really that well regarded anymore, the directions that he ended up going with in his life, I think the show is going to heavily disappoint you. It has a lot of ambitious ideas with the way the show is structured and things like that, but I do think more than a few of them actually end up hurting the show than ultimately helping it. I do think it's one of the more impressive Murphy projects in a while, but I just don't think it fully came together in the way that it really wanted to. So unfortunately, this is yet another Ryan Murphy miniseries that really disappointed me. So I am going to give Halston overall a C+. I do recommend checking this one out. I feel like no one's really talking about it, and that's a little upsetting because I feel like most of Ryan Murphy's projects, there's a lot of chatter around them, but this one I've heard radio silence about, and I do think it is worth a watch. I was able to finish this in one day, but again, that impact, it wasn't really there. He needs to do a much better job at taking advantage of the platform that he has, and I just don't think he's really done that overall. But other than that, guys, this is my review of Halston. Let me know what you guys saw this show overall, left your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.